Good morning, dearest friends. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, February 9th. Adar, the 8th of Adar Rishon. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time with Hashem's help. Presently, Masechah Shabbos, no longer chapter 11. We're now in chapter 12, Perek Haboine. And we're on to new topics, new horizons in the wonderful world of Shabbos. And we're dedicating our learning for the well-being of our dear members of our Chabura and their households. V'chol asher lahem, prayers for good health and koyach and all good blessings for our members and their families to continue to have the ability to study Gesundheit and Freilickeit. I also want to mention Esther Bas Moishe, the first yard site of the wife of someone who is from Toronto but comes around our shul. So I want to mention her name as well on her first yard site. And yesterday, we closed out Perek HaZoyrek with an interesting analysis of a Mishnah. First, much of our discussion had to do with what happens or what's going through a person's mind, meaning, do they realize they're doing a malacha or not? Is there awareness in the interim? And the unique way that this creates complexity in a scenario of zrika, of throwing, because when a person throws something, the item is no longer in their hands. And there were varying ways to interpret this, this Mishnah. But suffice it to say, generally speaking, to warrant a chatas, there has to be a consistent, continuous lack of realization that it is Shabbos, lack of realization that this act is prohibited. Let me just take one peek. No. But that's the crux of yesterday's Gemara. We ended off on a very interesting, or we came close to the end, in order to bring proof to the fact that if a person throws something and it intends to go to his dog, or intends to throw it into the fire, or intends to throw it to a receiver, that's very different than an interception. So we brought a brisa parenthetically, or a supportive brisa, which talks about the ability for a person to simultaneously check off a number of different prohibitions. Not that one should seek to do that, but Chazal were probing the ability for a single act to have a whole bunch of different problems. So if on Yom Kippur, a person is eating a prohibited food that has a variety of carbon-related problems, well, then you can end up racking up quite a bill. And unlike sometimes in the legal system where you might have, you can have multiple sentences that are, how do you call it? You simultaneously can be sitting or paying for multiple sentences. Here it appears that a person would actually have to bring multiple chatases. And it was quoted for a conversation about if a person could be considered carrying if there's food in their mouth. And the point was that if a person has a specific intention, that might create or make the moment to be considered an act of carrying, even if in a neutral default setting, that would not be so. So that was really yesterday's Gemara. And now in a moment, we're going to talk about areas, elements of construction. Dr. Hammer, you were going to say something? All right, so let's begin our new Mishnah. Again, with the L'chaim, a wonderful moment that we have the privilege, the opportunity to start a new chapter, chapter 12. And of course, gratitude to Hashem, gratitude to our wonderful Chabura, who don't just plug in, but make sure that it's a extremely thoughtful and scholarly discussion, assisting in contemporary analogies, and everyone brings their professional background or the insight from their professional background, which makes this truly a very, very special and unique Talmud Chabura. Rebero?
Rabbi, maybe there's something to be learned from the idea of so many sins, the Yom Kippur and all that. Maybe the message on the positive side is, even if you're doing something wrong, don't make it worse. Like Yom Kippur, don't go once already and start eating treif.
Okay, I like that. I like that. You can be even if you're in a trouble zone, try to avoid the compound trouble. The only problem, Rebero, with your point, which is a good one, is that here we're talking about someone who did it somehow inadvertently. I don't know how a person managed to get a ball of chaylev from a carbon that's expired on Yom Kippur, but suppose, I guess it could happen. And yeah, very interesting. So yeah, even if a person's in trouble, you could stop digging that hole. That is a good point. And of course, the additional aspect is that there is teshuvah available, and there is a pathway for atonement, even under such troublesome or troubling issues. So I want to read for you. Well, we'll start. This perek, an initial Mishnah, is going to talk about parts of the construction process and how much of those are considered a malacha, and the Mishnah is going to further probe why they're a malacha and how they're a malacha and what their function was. So the general style and nature of the conversation is going to be familiar, but the actual topics that we are addressing are, in a sense, distinct or unique, or at the very least, a deviation or a departure from our previous conversations. So the Mishnah starts, Haboina, a person does construction, Kamayivna v'yechayev, is there a shiur? So just like we spoke about that carrying is only considered carrying if you carry a certain amount, and kosev, writing is only considered writing if you write a certain amount of letters or spill a certain amount of ink. Well, similarly, is there a minimum shiur, a minimum amount of construction work, building, that would make a person chayiv, to have liable for having transgressed Shabbos? And again, as always, if a person did so unintentionally, they would have to bring a chatas. I just want to look at Tosfos. For some reason, they don't link the Tosfos here. Oh, they do. Okay. Haboina. The Tosfos is interesting here. He says, "Tzarich litain tam, amai toni boina achar zrika v'oitza." What is the common thread, or what is the reason for the chronology? What is the reason that as soon as we finish with talking about Zorek, why do we go to Haboina? What's going on over here? So interestingly, Tosfos doesn't give a reason. Tosfos seems to be saying that there needs to be some consideration. We need to figure out what is going on. Why is this conversation over here?
Is it possible, Rabbi? I remember yesterday I asked the question of why the term rock is used, if you recall.
Which term? I'm sorry?
Rock, R-O-C-K.
Oh, yes.
And it's not mentioned. It's just Steinsaltz, it's his translation.
Yes.
So if there's some history or reality to that, rocks are better known for destruction than anything else. Throwing a rock at something, whether it's, so maybe that's you then have to repair any damage that you've done by throwing what he calls a rock.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe. So I just want to think, if I had to think this through, Doctor, you wanted to share?
Let me ask you a question.
Go ahead.
Why is it even a question? Let's assume it was reversed and Bone was first and then Zrika. They would have the same
You're
question.
saying, so you're saying you're saying actually something very wise. You're saying sometimes, even if we don't have an answer, the fact that there is a premise for a question is already a wise insight. And so you're saying, is this just a kvetch? Any order we would put, you'd say, why do you do this way? That is a very good question. So I think, well, I'll tell you the answers that are presented, and then we'll have to go back and say, does that answer the question about the premise of the question? So first of all, we need to remember that there is a Mishnah, not a Mishnah, there's a Mishnah that goes through all of the Lamed Tes Malachis, the 39 Malachis. Who remembers, where was that? Here, let's find it. Hold on. No, I didn't want to do that. Bear with me a moment. Shabbos. So Klal Gadol had a Mishnah, a long Mishnah. Avos, Malachos, Arbaim, Chasar Achas. Okay, let's get to English. Here. There are 39 malachas. Hazareya, Choresh, Kotzer, Ma'amer, Dash, Zorah, Borer, Tochen, Meraked, Lush, Ofen. Goizes, Malabnoi, Menapsoi, etc., etc., etc. And it closes off with Hamoitzi, Mirshos, Tershos. Carrying and throwing. We have a number of additional malachas that we need to address. The question is, why didn't we go back to where we left off, which would have been, who remembers? We did. Well, anyways, we did discuss throughout the ensuing prakim a number of these malachas, but why don't we go back to where we left off? Why do we go to Boina, which is like randomly in middle? It goes, it seems like a very random way to continue. We maybe should have gone back to the beginning or where we left off. So I think that's what Tosfos is saying. It sounds kind of random to jump to Boina. I don't know if that really fully answers your question, but I think that gives a little bit of a perspective on what Tosfos is question. And so I believe your point is very, very important, that the question makes sense. Or your question was, does the question make sense? And I suppose the question is, of all the malachas, why would we jump back to Aboina, which is just smack in the middle of the list? And so let's do one more thing here, folks. And again, thank you for your patience. Here is the Mishnah. I want to see the Mefarshim on the Mishnah to see if we get any of that. So here, the Mishnah of our very Mishnah, which was quoted in the Gemara. In Safari, I opened it as a separate. Now we have the commentary of the Mishnah. Tosfos Yantiv. Kosvu HaTosfos. Tosfos comments, Sorich Litein Tam Amai Toni Haboina Achar Zrika V'Aitza. Tosfos asks the question, and he paraphrases the question, but it's actually a commentary. He says, why teach Haboina in the chronology after Zrika V'Aitza, right after Zrika V'Aitza? So here is the Tosfos Yantiv's explanation. The Achar Shapirish Dine Haitza. After going through exhaustively all about Haitza, because we have to admit, the Gemara has really given us an exhaustive review of Haitza and the domains, and the methods of carrying, and Akira and Hanacha, and everything, and throwing and carrying. So the EU is Siyum Adavis. And what happens is the Mishnah goes through all this malachas, and we basically focus our attention to carrying. So now Ratzal Lefarish Madasamachli. He wants to go back to the most immediate neighboring topics, which were V'humaka B'Patish. The second to last malacha is Maka B'Patish. So really, the Mishnah wanted to start with Hamaka B'Patish. Vishumi Ein Meleches Binyan, but because Maka B'Patish, using the hammer in however it is, if it's finishing a keli or it's detaching a stone or whatever, we will determine Maka B'Patish to mean. Because it is part of the general genre of Binyan, he took the closest reasonable item with which to pick up the conversation. This is the Tosfos Yantiv's explanation. So Tosfos asked a question. Tosfos Yantiv, The commentary on the Mishnah explains both the question that why choose this as the next malacha, and he explained what he explained, what we just said, that it was the most close but reasonable idea to discuss. Anyways, is that an acceptable answer? It works. All right, let's take a look at our Gemara. Let's take a look now at our Gemara. Wait, we didn't. No, we didn't do the Mishnah. I'm sorry. How much building is a problem? So the Gemara says, "Haboina kol shehu." Really, any amount of construction of building is problematic on Shabbos. Behamisates. What about chiseling? This word is famous because it's used in the prayer on Yom Kippur, Hine Kachomer B'yad HaYotzer, that describes the vulnerable and entirely dependent relationship that the Jewish people have with Hashem. And so we describe a whole bunch of different scenarios where the Jewish people are like an expert who is entirely in control of the craft. As we talk about a boat in the hands of the sailors. And one of the things it says is like a stone in the hand of the chiseler. There's got to be a better word for a chiseler, but the person who cuts and processes the stones. Now, someone say something because I'm not sure if my earphones are acting up.
How about a stone cutter?
A stone cutter.
A stone cutter, okay. All right, so hamisates, a stone cutter who chisels their wood with his keli. Let's see, Rashi, misates, mirabe as even. It means to smooth out, to square out the stone. Umitakenet, and he fixes it. And realize that stones need some touch-ups, but different styles of buildings, different builders have different preferences. Sometimes the stylists have a very smooth stone. There are other places where the stone should be somewhat rough or textured. And then he says, Baritz Ashkenaz. And so indeed, this is indeed the fact that, as we know, there are different styles and different ways to square off and to prepare a stone for construction. Those who are familiar with Baba Basra, we know that there is Avnei Gazis, right? There's different types of stones as well.
Rabbi,
Yes.
when we say building, did we ever define what that means? Does it mean that we're putting together material or doing something material to make a permanent structure? Or could it be something temporary? Can you take 8
Legos?
dishes and put one on top of the other to carry it to the kitchen?
Dr. Brilliant question. I believe the Gemara will, in short order, ask about, or actually the Mishnah, I think, is even reference. What about a temporary practice?
Right. Okay.
So again, haboina kolshu. But I guess the other question, which is a good question, is what is the exact definition of haboina? What kind of building? When is building, and when is it something else? I suppose building is the act of permanently fusing or piling or stacking or doing things that will create a structure. But let's leave the definition somewhat flexible. So Amasates, the stone cutter, is processing the stones.
Rabbi, probably building could also mean creating something temporary Like, for example, opening an umbrella also is considered to be building, although all the materials were already in place.
Possibly.
It just changed the shape, the form, or became usable for another purpose.
Yeah.
But still, it is also kind of building.
Yeah. Or as you may recall, we also talked about digging a hole outside as part of farming, and digging a hole inside could be part of boina. And so boina is pretty, or at least somewhat broad. Building can have different definitions. And I mean, look, there are civilizations that build into stone or into a mountain. There are others that build straw huts or whatever. So boina is a pretty broad term, at least at this point.
Rabbi,
Then, yeah,
is the issue of somebody building for you a completely different issue from this? How much they build, or that's completely different what people are allowed to do for you on Shabbos?
we're talking now about the essential act. We're not distinguishing at this point between if it is your proxy or oneself, although that may become a good question. But at this point, we're not distinguishing between different types of or who's doing the labor. But let's keep our eyes peeled
Keep your eye on the ball.
for additional commentary. Hold on 1 second. All right, we'll hold off. Okay. Hamaka bepatish, a person who strikes with a hammer. We've had this reference, but here is the Mishnah that is going to ask the question about Maka bepatish. So Maka bepatish is already enumerated in the Mishnah that we opened up here.
Isn't that supposed to be the final blow, the finishing touch, basically?
So let's see what Rashi says. Gamhu, because as you may recall, Rashi, Tosfos, there were varying nuanced definitions. We know we're talking about hitting with a hammer, but what exactly? So Rashi says, Gamhu be'avot melacha. Hitting with a hammer is also one of the primary categories of melacha. And v'hu belaz pick, which here we have as a hoe, me'ader, a hoe, shemefaitzes boyes even. It is a pick or some kind of hammer-like item that is used to smash the stone min hasela from its. We're talking about a stone that's being from the quarry. So there's a pick that breaks the rock free. After it's been entirely carved out. Umabdil beinahar kitzas humaka bepatish maka gedola. So imagine, as we know, most of the stones, and certainly the stones in Israel and elsewhere, were cut off of the mountain or out of the rock. And the way they would do it is they would do most of the work, carving, making it the right dimensions while still in the ground or on the mountainside. And then when it was entirely ready, it was just attached on the back. An extra blow would break this now properly designed, fashioned rock free. V'himit pareket v'nofelet. So what you do is you carve it out, you get it all perfect. It's just attached on the back. And then with a massive smack, it breaks forth, v'nofelet, and falls out of the mountain. V'zehu gemar malacha shel chaytz ve'even. And this is the final step of those who are cutting or mining or carving out stones from the earth. And similarly, any melacha, finishing off an item is also a melacha told us maka bepatish. So finishing things off can be conceptually akin to maka bepatish, the way that hitting with a hammer was part of the necessary process of dislodging and freeing a mountain, a rock from the mountain. Now we know that there are places today in Israel where we can find unfinished rocks that were in the middle of the process of being cut out of a quarry. Rabbi Beryl?
Rabbi, I don't understand where we're going. You have so many more problems before you do anything. You're picking up a hammer, you're carrying a pick, and these are not Shabbos Dika things to start with.
This is correct, but we're talking about a specific act as an additional malacha, and that is the makeh b'patish, finalizing your labor, making it whole or making it complete. Tosfos disagrees with Rashi. You want to see Tosfos? Look fast. That this hitting of a hammer on the rock was in order to dislodge and finally get the finished product of the stone that's been carved out of the mountain. The Einir rejects that this is pshat to be mishkan lo'hoya being an avonim, because let's think back to what we read in last week's parsha, and let's think about what we'll be reading with Hashem's help in the coming parshas. There were no rocks in the Mishkan. The Leishavik Tana Gemar Malacha the Kalim the Hava b'Mishkan v'Nakad Makeh b'Patish the Evan. It is implausible that the author of the Mishnah is thinking about the use of a hammer in the completion of a process of stone mining or quarrying, if there is a more likely pshat, which would be using a hammer in the construction of the kelim of the Mishkan. Elanir Lari, the Hay Makeh b'Patish, read Tosfos quote saying, what is Makeh b'Patish? Hainu makosh acharon shemakeh lakli b'shat gemar malacha. When you're fashioning a vessel and you're using a hammer to beat it out, to make it exactly so, the final hit, which makes it ready, that is Makeh b'Patish. And by the way, recently I had the privilege to visit somebody who makes kelim, usually jewelry, silverware, and she explained to me that she uses a hammer, and that's most of how she gets it to be the way she wants it to be. So apparently there is a final hit, and now it's ready. And so we have an interesting machlokes here between Rashi and Tosfot about the definition of Makeh b'Patish. Very interesting.
Rabbi,
Yes.
didn't we, on another item, have the issue of whether or not these building tools are muktzah on Shabbos? We're talking about then removing things from the table and if it's in the way, if you what about that big issue? I mean, we're talking about what you could do with it, but I think Rebberos talked about carrying. But what about just touching a shovel, a chisel?
So you're saying we're talking about using these tools. Well, isn't it muksa even to handle them, let alone to employ them?
Exactly.
So it is correct. However, muksa is possibly or likely a rabbinic facet, and now we're reviewing the Lametes Malachis that are of biblical nature. And so it's confusing, and there's a reason why all the commentaries keep on reiterating that all that we're talking about here, when we say potter, it doesn't mean you can do it. It's just the question is it part of a malacha? Is it part of a malacha deoraita? So there are certainly additional issues, or even as Rebberal mentioned, each of these malachas may have been precipitated by other steps that are also malacha. But to answer that question, maybe Beryl, though, all that work was done Erev Shabbos and sunsets. And the guy says, okay, I got to go home for Kiddush. Let me first dislodge, according to Rashi, let me dislodge this stone.
Fortunately, Rabbi, I got a heter that I'm able to use hammers all the time on Shabbos.
Never abuse
You're
a hammer.
surrounded by hammers.
Never abuse a hammer.
Right.
But no makas, Bernie, I hope. Just a patash.
All right, it is an interesting process to probe the nuanced differences between Rashi and Tosfos. Let's keep that open as an open discussion. But let's now we have those two ideas of the two definitions, we'll have more opportunity to talk about Makeh b'Patish, and we'll be able to see if there are practical implications in the broader discussion between Rashi and Tosfos. So back to the Gemara, and the Mishnah rather. Okay, boina, any amount is considered boina. It's problematic. Misates, the stone cutting, and Makeh b'Patish, be matzod. Matzod, I believe, is to is a hammer of sorts Rashi, yeah. Afu k'moi corners gadol shel barzel lebinyan shel barzel. We're talking about a massive sledgehammer, maybe the kind of sledgehammer that, what's his name? I don't know if we should say it. Thor. Does he hold a
Thor.
big hammer? Okay. That's avoid Zara. So, Hakodeach,
Could use Popeye.
Popeye. Is a hammer Popeye?
I
The
think
hammer
so.
that he used to
It's the
this
one
is at his
with the
hand.
sledgehammer.
No,
underneath.
Popeye doesn't have any hammers. Thor has the
His
only hammer.
hand. All right. Hakodeach kol shehu. Puncturing, piercing, drilling, I guess might be how Rabbi Steinsaltz tells us. Drilling, Rashi. Noikiv eitz oy even bakoisel. Puncturing, piercing, drilling into wood or into stone. Kol shehu, chayiv, you're chayiv. Rashi, kol shehu, akulu kai. In truth, the kol shehu is applied to all of the above mentioned things. Misates, makim bepatish, matzot kodeh. So all of these listed ideas, all of these enumerated malachas, all of them, one would be chayiv even if one does a minuscule, small amount. Zeh haklal. This is a rule in Shabbos. Kol ha'oisa malach. A person does a malach. Shabbos. And the work remains on Shabbos. I'm translating it first literally, and then we'll see Rashi. So you do the work, and it remains on Shabbos. Chayiv, you're chayiv. Rashi. What remains? What endures? Rashi. It needs no further work. It'll remain. Shabbos, chayiv. So a person does a melacha, and that melacha is sufficient to remain with a degree of permanence. One is chayiv. How long does the work need to be miskayem? How long does it need to endure? So, Rashi seems to be saying any work, any labor, any action that the item remains as is, the function, the contribution, the upgrade is indoors, well, then you've done enough work, you've done something of substance and of permanence in your chayiv. Not everybody has this interpretation.
A good example for that might be washing dishes on Shabbos.
Why? You're saying it endures. Once they're clean, they remain.
Yeah, but I mean, there are people who I know, I mean, very observant people who don't, and there are people in that same category who do. So I'm just saying it's a matter of interpretation.
Interesting. Yes. So the klal is if you do work and your melacha remains, you're chayiv. There's two ways. Basically, here, let me just show you. There's two ways to read it. You can either say kol ha'osa melacha melachta miskayemes, kama b'Shabbos. If you do a work that's enduring on Shabbos chayiv, or you could read if you do a work which will endure for the duration of Shabbos chayiv. Which melacha is more of a long-term, solid achievement, and which one is more fickle? So the second way I read it to you, malachta miskemes b'Shabbos, it remains in place until the end of Shabbos. That's a whole lot more fickle. It's a whole lot less enduring.
Rabbi, am I entitled to a ridiculous question?
You're not entitled to call your question
The guy
ridiculous,
is
but you're
building.
entitled to ask a question.
Guy's building a sukkah on Shabbos. He only wants it to last a week.
Well, I think here we're talking about 24 hours or 48 hours. But I wanted to show you, but I'm not seeing it here. All right, we'll keep an eye. Okay, anyway, so that's the klal. So we'll discuss this further with Hashem's help in the Gemara.
Let me
Rabbi
ask you a
Shimon Gamliel Omer. Similarly, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says,
I have a
"Afamake."
question.
Sorry,
I have a question. I have a question.
go ahead.
So, Melachta Miskamen B'Shabbos, he completes it. If somebody starts a function before Shabbos and has a mind to finish before, but forgets and continues into Shabbos, and then only a small amount into Shabbos, and but that amount now makes it complete. What he did. So that makes him chayiv on the whole thing, or is it just because he did a small amount that on its own would not have been?
So again, we're not really finished with the conversation, but based on what we are reading, there's for sure a chiyuv. The question is how much, because he certainly did makeh b'patish or a volume of shir of kolshu of melacha and Shabbos, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look. Oh, v'chein Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Similarly, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel taught, afamake b'kornis al asadon. If a person uses a hammer on his sledgehammer during labor on the anvil, chayiv b'nei shu k'misakein melacha. Rashi. Let's say blez. A tripod doesn't help me much. Anyway, so he says, even if you just hit, hold on. What just happened? Even if you simply strike your hammer on your animal, once chayiv and bnei shu k'misakein melacha, he's improving, he's doing something that is constructive and contributing to what he's doing. You may recall we actually referenced this. There's two things. You're using the hammer to build out, to smooth out the metal. You also occasionally need to fix up or do something to service your hammer. So I believe what we're talking about here is that he is fixing up his hammer. That's also considered constructive. The Gemara is going to discuss further, and so therefore let's hold our in-depth analysis for the Gemara's commentary. But suffice it to say, even if the hitting of the hammer does not contribute to his primary melacha, but it improves on his hammer, that too could be a problem, because we always want our hammers to be improved, and they always do improve.
Amen.
All right, so that's the Mishnah. So there's a lot to unpack in the Mishnah. And again, the Gemara is going to do a lot of the unpacking for us with Hashem's help. But now our Gemara is going to try to figure out, what does it mean? What is a small amount of binyan? And is it helpful? Is it constructive? Or is in other words, when we said kolshu, any small amount of construction, that's prohibited. Why is that? Is it because if you keep on doing it, cumulatively, it'll amount to something of value? Or, as the Gemara is going to assert, there is something of value even in your minute act of construction. And what is the value of something very, very minimal in the realm of boina? Why should a person be chayiv? In the Gemara's way of expressing it, kol shehu l'mai chazi. What good is a minute degree, a minute amount of construction? How does that help anyone or anything? And if no one needs it and no one wants it, why is that considered a malacha? As we know, it has to be constructive and it has to meet the minimum definition of a malacha. Rav Yirmiyah says, I'll tell you why. Because in life, there are many occasions where even a small amount of malacha is chashuv. For example, shekein ani chayfer guma latniya boy prutaisa. For example, a poor person might dig a small little hole to hide their coins. You're not building a building, but you are carving out a little hole that is constructive for the ani. It's constructive because he needs his money to be hidden. And as we know, digging, because we mentioned this before, and I mentioned it today, is also possibly part of Boina. You're building a storage space. The Kavasogabe Mishkan, and in truth, there is a similar situation in the Mishkan. How so? Shekin Tofre Yeriot. We read in last week's Parsha that the Mishkan walls and roof was made of, and we also learned it in our Gemara a few weeks ago. It was made out of material that needed to be stitched together. Well, where do those sewing people, the seamstresses, where do they hide their needles? They would dig a hole to hide their needles. That was where they would store them. Gemara says, no, that can't be. Abaya says, I reject this as the minimum value of Boina on Shabbos in the Mishkan. Why? The mishatchi, because if you'll place your metal needles into the ground, they will become rusty. And loy avdehachi, therefore, people, the professionals, would not hide their needles in the ground because they need those needles to work. Archaeologists would be very grateful if they would hide their needles in the ground, but not good for preserving your needles. Ella, rather, what might be a minuscule amount of boina that would be constructive and helpful? Shekein ani oisa pit pute kira kitana. A poor person would make legs for their little oven. Lish baisala kedera kadana, to place upon it a little oven. Rashi ragle kira kimin kli barzel shel current tripod mamidin akira shel cheres. So a person would make small legs, a small amount of construction. The Kavasaga Mishkan, and the same thing in the Mishkan, we have mevashli samonim litzboya yeriyos. There was dyeing in the Mishkan. You had to dye different yarns and threads and material, shechasra b'melachtan, which were needed. So what they do is they would construct, they would create a little stand for the stove, and so this is a small nominal amount of melacha that was necessary for the Mishkan. Rashi, what if they were just a little short on the amount of wool they needed? Let's say they did all the work and they needed just a little bit more. So they have a little pot, and they'd make a little stand, or maybe a little. And so there we have a small amount of malacha that is constructive. The Gemara doesn't like this explanation either. Oh, by the way, you want to see a picture? You want to see a picture? In case you weren't sure what it looks like to have a needle hidden in the ground, there you go. They would build little legs to place on it in an oven. So I'm not sure if we're talking about the boina of affixing the legs, or maybe we're talking about just putting the leg into the ground, which was a very nominal amount of malacha that might be considered a malacha kosher. The Gemara doesn't like this either. Temple stuff, temple protocol, and even the construction project was great. They always made extra material. They always prepared extra threads. They always wove extra tapestries and yeriot, curtains. And so there's no chance that at the end of the day, they were cooking up a little more to dye a few more threads. That's not the way the Mishkan was constructed. Rashi, when the Jews built the construction of the Mishkan, as we know, there was an abundance of material to the point where there was access, there was extra. And therefore, we are certain that in the Mishkan, they were not making little tripods to cook a little oven, to cook a little pot with a little bit of dyeing material. Ella shekain balabayis sheyesh leineka bibirosai v'soismai. Rather, the analogy of a small amount of melacha work would be that if a person has a small hole in their wall, Rashi bira naashu oichel v'shoichev makbid al chor katan sheba imegunahu v'soismai v'tit. In a person's living spaces, and there's a small hole, they will seal it up. The Kavasegam, the Mishkan, and the same thing was true in the Mishkan. Shekin Keresh Shenafla by Darna, if one of the beams of the Mishkan had a Darna, which is a worm that ate a hole, Matif Letoicha Avar Visoismai. They would pour a little bit of lead. They didn't know about the hazards of lead back then, and they'd use lead to seal in the hole. And so we're talking about a little hole that was filled in. That's a minuscule amount of boina, and yet it was necessary in the Mishkan for quality control, and therefore, to this day, on Shabbos, we're not allowed to do even a minuscule, minute amount of labor, a minute amount of malach. I have a question. I don't know if it's a good question, but I'm wondering that if we say Ein Aniyus B'Makom Ashirus in the Beis Hamikdash, they didn't act in any way following the anything that would convey poorness or poverty. Well, then I would imagine if a worm ate a hole in one of the crushim, wouldn't they just replace them? So isn't filling in a hole, patching, isn't that also a poverty mentality? Probably the answer is that in the desert, they didn't have the luxury of being able to chop down wood whenever they needed to construct another keresh. And so it's possible that a unforeseen small damage may have been fixable. And it's also possible that in the time of the Gemara, in the time of the Mishnah, maybe to this day, normal people would also find it to be quite reasonable to patch up a small hole. They wouldn't demolish the house the moment there was the smallest crack. So maybe this is not considered unused, but something to consider. And so this concludes the first discussion, which is it so that we use that even a minute amount of construction could be considered reasonable, and it might have existed in the time of the Mishkan? And the Gemara answers, after a little bit of a process, yes. Not poverty, pauper mentality, but even people that live in beautiful mansions occasionally might have a little crack, a little hole that needs to be patched up. And that's the cost of living. That's just what happens. There you go. Any comments, thoughts?
I was just thinking something funny, that you're sitting at a table, let's say a man-made table, a makeup table, something
Right.
weak or something like that, and you get angry and you slam your fist on the table and you break the table. Is that wrong?
Is that wrong, or is it a malacha?
Is it a malacha?
Well, let me ask you this. Did you intend to break the table?
In anger, you don't think.
Good. Actually, it's a very good question. You're actually asking a very good question. I'll tell you, but the question really is, and we're going to get there. If a person destroys, building is a malacha. Demolition is also a malacha, which we'll discuss, God willing, soon. The question is, we've said it a number of times that malacha needs to be constructive, right? And so demolition can be constructive if the demo is occurring in order to build in the site or in the place or with the materials that have now been demolished. What if a person destroys something, but not in order to build, but it is constructive because we need an outlet to vent our frustration or anger? So is that considered constructive demolition that's prohibited, or is it considered pointless demolition, which one might be exempt for? So that is a question, a legitimate question that's going to be addressed, God willing, on Kuf Hey Amud Beis 105b. There's a question, HaKoreya B'chamato, if you tear, ruin something, or you damage something. So we'll discuss that. So you're actually asking a very good question, and we'll get into. God willing, we'll be there in
Rabbi,
a few days. Yes.
what if that same action is the opposite? You do something, and by doing it, it improved it. Is that boina?
So you're saying, would that be considered a boina b'shkaga? You didn't realize
the
that
other
you're
way
actually
around. I'm trying to think of an example, but you covered something that was
You try
leaking
throwing a
by
rock at your
mistake.
friend, and you end up hitting the nail into the wall and fixing a broken path.
Yeah, the dart goes into the hole that we're dealing with.
Interesting question. let's begin the next segment of the Gemara, although we're going to probably have to stop in the middle. And now we're talking about stone setting. Why are people setting stones? So in case you were wondering, we'll take a look at our dear illustrator. Oh, in case you're wondering what it looks like to fill in a hole.
He's right. He's right-handed,
Again, he
is
became right.
right.
Same guy. He's ambidextrous.
ambidextrous. Right.
Is that a loaf of? Is that the same loaf of bread that he's been carrying around?
Yeah. By now, it's hard enough to fill the hole.
No, maybe he's really left-handed. He's holding his bread and he's using his left hand.
He's wearing a
Um,
different uniform. Maybe his other uniform is in the dry cleaners.
Yeah, he changed the colors, right?
Right.
Anyways, laying stones or setting stones apparently is part of the process of building walls. So if you mitzaded es ha'even, you set a stone. Chayiv, your one is liable. Rashi, moishiva umitzadeda. You place it and affix it. Adshemis yasheves bekarkois. You saw that bingin until it is strongly and stably affixed in the foundation, the bottom of your building. By arranging it and affixing it, he is essentially preparing the bottom row of the wall or the floor. Even without applying any cement, just by positioning and balancing the stone, one is chayiv. This would be an instance of boina kolshu, the smallest amount of construction. The yesh mekaymin came b'leitit because there are construction projects and there were construction techniques where they might be able to avoid applying cement. And indeed, archaeologists and those of us who enjoy studying different archaeological finds in Israel, there are structures, especially first temple era structures, or I think maybe even second temple era structures, where we find that there are parts of the walls which were not used, that did not use mortar or cement. They were simply so well positioned and interlocked that they would be considered permanent. And today the equivalent would probably be, Rebero, I'm waiting for you to say it, IKEA. Right? There's plenty of IKEA furniture which are just interlocked. Not only IKEA, but IKEA somehow became the interlocking furniture or other items that can be constructed just with the positioning and the fitting, and so that could be considered boina.
Put in a plug for my son, Lego.
Oh, yeah. It's actually a good shiloh about Lego. Is Lego considered boina? Maybe at the end of our Gemara, we'll have to consider what the halacha of boina is. Now, I'm going to stop the sharing screen for a moment, but I want to show you something, nothing to do with Gemara, but so fascinating that I want to show it to you. Anyways, stand by. Just give me a moment if you don't mind. And well, I'll tell you, and I'll see if I want to show you on the screen. I don't know if you know this, but in Crown Heights, right next to 770 Eastern Parkway, there is a library, a very famous library. There was a famous saga about the ownership of the library, which maybe some of you are familiar with. But what you may be less familiar with is that it is actually a very vast library and has many very important and interesting Jewish documents and items of great significance to the broader Jewish world. So I just want to show you one or two pictures, or one picture for now, that I find to be very interesting. So I'm going to share the screen again, and then we'll call it a day. One of the items that is in the possession of the library of essentially the Rebbe, but originally the previous Rebbe, is a handwritten manuscript Siddur, which was owned by and used by the Baal Shem Tov. It was written by his famous brother-in-law, Gershom Kitover, I believe. And there's a lot of Kabbalistic stuff, which is way, way, way beyond my pay grade, to be honest. And there are some fascinating things, which I don't have a picture for you now. Maybe I'll show you another time. For example, in the Baal Shem Tov Siddur, there is a handwritten note by a very, very famous Hasidic rabbi called Michal Zlotchever. Famous man, big tzaddik. And he writes in there, please have me and my wife in mind in your prayers. Inside the Siddur of the Baal Shem Tov, there's also the founder of the Chernobyl dynasty. So the great grandfather of just about anyone in the Hasidic world that has the last name Twersky. So we're talking about Square, and we're talking about, it's a massive family, the Twersky dynasty. We recently had the first yahrzeit of Rabbi Dr. Twersky. So this is his great grandfather.
Let me ask you a question.
Hold on.
about this.
So his name
Okay.
is also inscribed in the Siddur, asking the Baal Shem Tov to have him in mind. I just want to show you one thing, and then please ask the question. This is a picture of benching, Birkat Hamazon. And I want to show you the second to last line. Kiyim liyadcha, hamleya, hapsucha. So we say in benching, we ask Hashem to provide for us, then we shouldn't need matnas b'sar v'dam. We shouldn't need a handout from other human beings. We shouldn't need loans. We hope to receive all of our sustenance. Liyadcha, hamleya, from Hashem's hand, which is full, psucha, open, and hakadoisha, holy, v'harchava, and broad, wide. Shalei nevosh, we shouldn't be ashamed, we're embarrassed forever. But the word hakadoisha here is misspelled. That's kuf, that's a gimel. Hakadoisha, gadush means overflowing, and this wasn't a typo. There was a nusach invention that says mliyatcha mleya psucha hakadosha, Hashem's overflowing hand. So that's a very interesting typo, but a very interesting variant nusach. And the reason why this is well known, I reference this on occasion because the Rebbe would many times talk about it. Hashem has a holy hand, but Hashem also has a hand that's overflowing and eager to share in abundance. And so this is a famous anomaly, if you will, in the nusach of the Baal Shem Tov Siddur. I wanted to share with you. Dr. Stamler, go ahead, please.
So I saw the Kedusha, that didn't bother me so much, but Harchava, if you look at it looks like there is a correction there, like it's written with a vav and possibly a bet underneath.
That's
Do you see
interesting.
what
I didn't notice
do
that,
you
but that
see-
is
So Rechava, there's Rechava with a vav, revach, and there's Rechava Y, with a bet also. So both words would be correct. So I see here, do you see what I'm saying? It looks like there's
Viharchava. Is that a vase
Right.
or a vav?
or a vav. It looks
Interesting.
like it's one is superimposed over the other. Both would be correct. Both ways would be beneficial. But one would be revach and one would be rechava, wide.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. And so
By
the
way,
whole
there
thing.
are there are other places which are not consistent earlier. Forget about the lettering, but the text is not consistent with how we bench now. I mean,
Well, first of all, Baruch Atah, and this is a Kabbalistically spelt out name of Hashem, which I cannot begin to explain because it's not above my pay grade. Allah Eretz v'Ala Mazon. And then on the side over here, there are like Kabbalistic Arizal-like meditations and ideas. Rachim Hashem Elokeinu Aleinu Al Yisrael Lamecha. Yeah, I mean, this is in general. Any manuscript siddur that you'll find from this era, 200, 300, 400 years, is not going to be consistent with our siddurim. And there's also like a whole bunch of different, handwritten additions and amendments. And I don't know enough to know if this was this may have been a template siddur with some small amendments. This may have been entirely custom. I don't know. It is known. I just don't know. Rachim Nashon Leknei Yisrael Mecha v'al Yerushalayim Yirecha v'al Tzion Mishkan K'medecha v'al Malchus Be'yistav Mishachecha v'al the floating hay Habayis Hagadol v'Hakadosh Shenikra. You see, they forgot the nun, so the nun is added over here.
yes.
But again, this is the nature of a handwritten
Right.
manuscript. So I'm going to try to find out more about this, but it just went online, and you can literally flip through the entire 290 pages of the Baal Shem Tov Siddur. You have to understand, this was a book that was basically held and guarded and owned by Yechidei Segul, one person. We have the chain of custody from the Baal Shem Tov to his grandson, who was traveling with a friend, and he ended up dying on the road, and it went over into the Chernobyl dynasty, and it was owned by a great-great-granddaughter whose husband ends up becoming impoverished, and the previous Rebbe buys it from him in Warsaw for $4,000. And today this is a multi-million-dollar value, valued at many, many millions of dollars, and you can flip through the entire thing. Anyways, wanted to share that with you. Thank you all for joining us for today's overtime Talmud discussion. I'm going to link, and then everyone's invited to rejoin immediately to study Chumash with Rabbi Shalom Ber. Thank you all so much for indulging me on this tangent, but it's very interesting. There's many other things as well that were put online,
Thank you.
other manuscripts and fascinating stuff. The problem is a lot of times you have to know what you're looking for to find, and that's the challenge with such a digital library. It's not so, the index is not so, well, those that know. But anyways, Yasher Koyach, thank you all. Have a wonderful day and look forward to Be'ezer Hashem.